Hi, my name is Eva Steiner and this is my project Psychotherapists Around the Globe. I am interviewing the psychotherapists around the world and asking them the same 8 questions. I am wondering how mental health profession is in their country. Today we are going to Thank you for taking this time for doing this interview with me. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Steffi. I'm a counseling psychologist by profession. I did my undergraduate here in Malta, but then I did my doctorate abroad in the UK. Now I'm back in Malta. I work mostly in private practice and I work with children aged 3 upwards. I also work with adults, but I've also started working in the area of perinatal and infant mental health, which means sometimes I see parents with their babies as well. So that's kind of an area that I've moved into recently.
So tell me a little bit about your culture. What is some holiday or tradition that your country celebrates? And if your culture would be an emotion, what emotion would it be?
I think I'll start with the emotion because I thought a little bit about this. I think as an emotion, I think I would choose passionate because I think that kind of describes the fiery passion that sometimes I think is maybe a little bit too much, but also the love behind the passion as well. So I think as a culture, we're very proud of our heritage. So we've kind of come, our history, we've had a lot of colonization. We were conquered by many, many different countries over thousands of years. So I think kind of now that we're independent, we're very proud of our heritage and where we've come from. We're one of the smallest countries in the world, but we have our own language, which is always a nice thing to have. And so I think we're quite passionate about quite a few things as a culture, and we're very protective of each other as people. I think when it comes to the holidays, we're still quite a religious country. So I don't know percentage-wise, but there's a very high percentage of the country that is Catholic. So every town and every village has their own village feast that's celebrated in summer. So basically we have from almost beginning of June till end of September, every week there's 1 or 2 feasts going on in the country that's celebrated throughout 5 days with the bands and the fireworks and the food stalls. A lot of people go to these village feasts, so those are quite a big deal here. And then you have obviously all the religious holidays, so Christmas, Easter. Public holidays, not so much, as in celebrate them by like just being off work and going to the beach. So I would say kind of the village feasts, Christmas and Easter are kind of the big ones here. And people take them quite seriously. So they usually spend it around family, for example, lots of family gatherings, celebrations, we do lots of barbecues here just because the weather is always so warm.
How other people see you or describe you?
I think from the foreign friends that I have, usually, I can't speak for everyone because I think it depends on their interaction with the people. But in generally, I think they see it as quite a welcoming nation. I'm not going to lie, there's still a bit of a problem with racism here. So I wouldn't say we've completely accepted everybody. So there's still a small percentage, a small minority that still post racist comments, for example. I don't know if that's coming again from the colonialism, but that is still a bit of a problem here. Other than that, usually we're quite a welcoming, at least this is what the feedback I get, quite a welcoming nation. I think in certain sectors as well, it's become very multicultural. So for example, if you work in the iGaming sector, it's very normal that I would say almost 70% of the workforce there would be from different countries. I think we've become accustomed to having quite a lot of foreigners living here from various parts of the world. We can be a bit fiery sometimes because we're so overly populated. There's a very big traffic problem, so lots of people get hot-headed in traffic, for example. So I don't know if they would have had maybe a negative interaction with them. Maybe they would say that we're kind of a bit angry, but I wouldn't say that that's the majority of the people. I think most people have had a good experience. I hope that's the feedback that I've received.
How did you become a psychotherapist in your country, and what is your psychotherapeutic approach?
I studied to be a psychologist, not a psychotherapist, because here there are 2 different careers. So like I said, I did my undergrad, I did it in Malta, and then I applied to do my doctorate in counseling psychology in the UK. But for people who train here, because I teach on the course here, they would normally do a bachelor degree over here, and then they would apply to do a master's degree in psychology in the whatever different areas, or they would do a master's in psychotherapy. I believe the one that's offered here is Gestalt psychotherapy. So if you want to specialize specifically in psychotherapy in Malta, I believe it's Gestalt that's offered over here. Then you would need to kind of specialize abroad. So there's that, or there would be the Masters in Counseling, or there would be the Masters in Psychology. So you would kind of choose down those routes. My psychotherapeutic approach is mostly psychodynamic, coming from object relations theory and a lot of attachment theory. So that's kind of where I feel comfortable. And even kind of drawing now on infant mental health, I draw a lot on my psychodynamic and attachment training for that. So obviously they work very well hand in hand.
And in Malta, you need a psychology degree to then approach like clinical psychology or counseling psychology or Gestalt?
It depends. So if you're going into a master's in psychology, you need to have a bachelor in psychology. If you're going into Gestalt or family therapy, or because family therapy is also offered as a training, you wouldn't need to. So you could come from a social work background, for example, and still apply for that. But I think for masters in psychology, you have to have a bachelor. I could be wrong, but as far as I know, you need to have a bachelor in psychology or some kind of top up. So perhaps you'd have done a degree in social work and then maybe you get the higher diploma in psychology, and then you can kind of apply that way.
And is there a law for psychology or psychotherapy?
Yes, so over here in Malta, the counseling profession, the counseling, psychotherapy and psychology, they're all regulated by their own profession. This came in for psychotherapy, I believe, I'm not sure counseling, it came in quite recently, I think over the past 5 or 6 years. But yes, you need to be registered, so you need to do a number of years after you've qualified, and then you can register to get your warrant. And it's the same for counseling, psychotherapy and psychology. So they're regulated professions across the board. So unless you're warranted, you can't call yourself a psychologist or a psychotherapist, for example. You need to be registered, which I think is different in some countries, because I know, for example, in the UK, the term psychologist is not a protected title.
And once you are registered as a psychologist, psychotherapist, or counselor, are you able to work in public sector as well as in private sector?
You can work in both. The process here is, at least I can speak for psychology because I'm not sure about the other branches. But once you graduate, you get the term psychology practitioner. And it's assumed that you have around 2 years working towards your warrant. But you can work in the public sector. I believe you can also work in the private sector as long as the clients are aware that you're not warranted and obviously you're receiving supervision. But most people tend to go into the public sector to get kind of their first experience. And then once they're warranted, they either stay in the government and do private practice or they move out. It depends. But it's quite common for people to work in the public sector and also privately after.
How society looks upon psychotherapy or any psychological help?
As it stands now, I don't feel like there's much of a taboo here anymore. There's quite a few mental health campaigns. I don't know why I would say it's encouraged, but I don't feel like there is a taboo like there might have been maybe 20 years ago, for example. What I feel is there's still a bit of resistance. So, for example, if I would encourage someone, listen, I think you need to speak to a therapist. If I speak to young people, it's almost not a big thing that they would tell me, yes, I'm in therapy or I see this person. So it's talked about a lot more than I think it would have been 15 years ago. But I still find some resistance when I try to refer to family therapy. So for couples counseling, I feel people become a lot more resistant. They tell me they will call and then they don't end up calling. There's still a bit of this idea that problems at home should be dealt with at home or between the couple. It's getting much better, but I still find that within the couple, there's a bit of resistance. Or for example, I can imagine that if I had to tell someone, yes, they're in couples counseling, their first instinct would be, are they getting a divorce kind of thing, rather than maybe the idea that they just want to strengthen their relationship or improve communication. So I think with family therapy, there's still a little bit of a resistance or a bit of a perceived red flag. So it's like if I had to tell them, listen, would you consider going to couples counseling? Because it's almost as though some people get offended as well. It's like I'm kind of telling them that their marriage isn't working or stuff like that. So I feel like people are more open to individual work so far, unless obviously it concerns their children. So when it comes to their children, I feel people are more open to take them to someone, for example.
Interesting.
It's improving, but I still feel like there's a bit of this, I need a psychiatrist. Like there's still a lot of weight attached to that word. And then I kind of explain, listen, You can go to your GP and your GP can prescribe certain medications, but in this case, obviously, the psychiatrist is a little bit more specialized in medications relating to mental health. And then they kind of calm down a little bit, but I think there's still this association of psychiatry, mental health hospital admission. There's still a little bit of that fear, I think. So I would say with family therapy and psychiatry, but again, psychiatry is improving a lot. So even if I had to suggest to a parent, listen, perhaps you might want to talk to a psychiatrist about your son, I get much less resistance than I did even 5 years ago or 6 years ago, for example. So I think it's a lot more accepted now. But then I think when we're touching the couple dynamic, people get they resist a little bit more. I think they're afraid that maybe some issues will come out that they've been kind of keeping closed up, and there's obviously fear of abandonment and fear that maybe the situation will be worse than they think. So obviously there are reasons why they would be resistant, but
And in the past, what was some mental health stigma, or maybe still is in these days?
I don't know if it's a stigma as such. Obviously, kind of maybe the more severe mental health pathology, so things like schizophrenia, for example, bipolar, maybe those have been kept a little bit more quiet. I assume more people who self-harm or have had suicide attempts in the past. I feel like people talked about, even now, I guess people talk about it much less. So things like that, postnatal depression, I imagine would have not been really spoken about even till today. I still struggle, kind of to make it a bit more vocal, and the fact that, listen, kind of you need to get help. It's not just baby blues and things like that. So I think it's more so with those things, potentially PTSD. So I think something that would have been attached to either some form of severity, or there would have been some kind of misconception or taboo, for example, linking schizophrenia to specific harming behaviors, which we know is not necessarily the case. Obviously, you can be kind of hearing voices and not ever hurt anybody. But obviously, there are these misconceptions and these myths around mental illness. So in that case, I think people would still be a bit kind of wary of discussing their issues, which obviously then makes it harder for them to get help. They feel more lonely. It makes the situation worse. So
what is your society teaching about child-parent relationship, and whether this value of society also influence how you design your interventions as a therapist?
So I think over the past few years, there's been some really good movements here with regards to things like positive parenting, for example. So there are huge campaigns around positive parenting, gentle parenting. Like they did a whole pilot project working with perinatal moms and parents, offering couples counseling, psychoeducation, individual stuff. So there was this big pilot project for around a year where people could access the service for free. Again, like I said, lots of campaigns. There's a perinatal mental health clinic, which again is kind of there to kind of help pick out issues before they become issues, if that makes sense, and they follow them up to 1 year after the birth. There are people kind of who are trained in VIG, which is video interactive guidance, which helps parents bond with their children when perhaps there are some issues. So I think as a country, we're moving forward quite a bit with that. The information is out there, basically. So for those who want to hear it, there's quite a lot of information there, and there's a lot of services that can help. I don't know if they're aware of all the services, but there's quite a few services. So I think as a nation, we're moving a lot towards parent-infant interaction being really, really important, especially kind of in the context of child protection cases. Ideally, we avoid them getting to child protection issues, because we might help with the bonding and with the parents who are overwhelmed or whatever.
Do you have like a maternity leave for how long, or paternity leave?
So if you're employed in a company, I think you get up to 4 months paid paternity leave, and then you can take more, but it won't be paid, basically. I think the government subsidizes something. So that would be 16 weeks paid, full pay maternity leave. Fathers, I think, get 10 days now paid paternity leave. It was only introduced August of last year, so quite late in the game. And then if you're self-employed, you can still get the maternity benefit, but this is paid for by the government. And basically, it's like the minimum wage that you would get. So it's not as good, obviously, as when you're working with a company. And then obviously kind of you choose, but it's around 4 months, the time frame for maternity leave.
So in one way, like parental education is strong in Malta, but maybe systematic supporting a parent to raise their child, to be present, it's not there yet. Not that it's not there, it's not where
it's not backed up.
Should be.
It's not backed up. In reality, we can do all the education in the world, but then they'll tell you, okay, then give me a solution. What am I meant to do? But within our small practices, what we do is we can say, okay, if you have very limited time, make sure you have 15 minutes a day where you connect with your child consistently. And everybody can find 15 minutes, even if it's while they're going to bed or while they're driving them to school or while they're feeding, as long as it's 15 minutes of uninterrupted connection. So it's not me talking to you and answering emails on my phone at the same time. It's 15 minutes where our phone is in another room, because sometimes even if we just put our phone down on the table, it's still there, So kind of giving the message that, listen, these 15 minutes are just ours. So we work with what we have, with the limitations that we have, but it would be good if we had more support and backing from the people who could make a difference. Because again, like we said, it's one thing educating. It's another thing having proper backing, So what we would like to see is companies offering parents reduced hours, proper reduced hours, but in those reduced hours, you're not constantly calling them and telling them to join a meeting from home. That's not reduced hours. It's just working from home. Or more incentives for people to work from home. So COVID helped a lot with this, but I know that there are some companies who insist on them being present all the time. I question, do they really need to be there all the time? Because some roles can be done from home. That is the reality. I see with my own children, if I have a session upstairs in the room, they know they can't come in. I lock the door. They know that's kind of mommy's working. But I see the difference when I have to go to the clinic or when I'm up here. And I just tell them, no, today is from home, just from upstairs. And their face lights up because they know that the minute I finish, I can just go downstairs. I don't have to travel. I don't have to walk to my car and take another 40 minutes to get home. So it does make a difference. So I think we need to be implementing proper flexible measures and not just kind of finding a way out of saying, well, you have this as an option. Yes, you can use it, but let's also have other options, One more thing regarding this question, and this is, I want to understand culturally, is like more of the individualistic culture and the children get out of the house once they go to college, or it's more community culture? So it's mostly a very big community-based culture. Even, for example, here, when we choose not to send our children to childcare for whatever reason. So in my case, for example, childcare didn't make sense because most of my work is done in the afternoon. Most of the childcares that I saw, kind of their activities, the actual activities stopped by 2. So I said, if I take them to childcare till 2 and I start work at 3, I'll never see my kids until 7 o'clock. So that didn't make sense for me. But luckily, we rely a lot on the grandparents. So here, the grandparents are very close. They usually live a 15-minute drive away. Mostly are very happy to kind of help out. So they tend to babysit while the parents are working for a couple of hours here and there. So there's that sense of community. Sometimes they might bring food as well, or say, like, just come over for dinner, or I'll feed them and wash them, kind of. So we rely more, I think, on the family childcare and the family unit. So we're very blessed in that sense that our parents don't live a 3-hour drive away. You can just call them and within 15 minutes, they're there should we need. And even kind of as they grow up, there isn't the culture that you move out here at 18. So there's one major university here, which again is within distance, like driving distance. So people don't really move out to live on campus or anything like that. So normally people tend to move out unless they emigrate, usually a bit before they get married in their late 20s, or even if they're not married. But usually I think the average age of moving out would be 25 plus, I would say. So we stay at home quite a longer time than most places in Europe. The idea here is that you stay until, you're working, you have a stable income, and then you can afford to buy your own place. Because here as well, the culture, people, at least local people, don't tend to rent as much. They invest in property. So obviously that takes a while until you can obviously save up for your deposit, your mortgage, stuff like that. Let's say that the client comes to you and say, I don't want to see my parents anymore. I want to cut contact. How would culture look upon such a request? How the therapist approach if this happens? I think obviously it depends on the age of the clients, no? So if they're adults, I don't think there would be any issue. Obviously we would work through whatever issues are leading to this in therapy, but there wouldn't be any issues. If you're dealing with a minor, it gets a bit more complicated. And usually I would kind of, obviously we can't tell them what to do, but I would explore a lot of the reasons behind it. Ideally, I would try and get the client on board to maybe take on more of a systemic approach, try and see what went wrong, see if there can be any reparation. So I don't think we would take the approach of a 15-year-old wanting to cut contact completely to say, okay, fine, it's your choice. Especially being a minor, would always want to see kind of what's going on. But if it's an adult and they live in a toxic environment, then who are we to kind of, So culturally, I think again it depends on the age of the client. If it's a minor, they can't just leave. They would need to go into care if they had to kind of cut off contact. So they either would live with another family member or they would need to go into care. So it gets a little bit more complicated if it's a minor.
What are the learned beliefs regarding client-therapist relationship, and can the relationship continue outside the therapy once the therapy process is over?
So I don't know about other countries, but we tend to follow the ethical guidelines, which are very similar to the ethical guidelines in the UK, and with the HCPC and the BPS, would say strictly to try and avoid dual relationships as much as possible, even after the therapy has ended. Now, with Malta being such a small country, unfortunately, sometimes you can't avoid dual relationships. So I've had an ex-client, for example, who goes to my son's school. So I bump into his mom all the time. So it's not ideal, Or a client of mine I found out was a cousin of a very good friend of mine. So whenever there's joint parties, unfortunately, she's there. So, and again, she's an ex-client. So what I tend to do is I kind of get in contact before. I ask her if things are strange for her. And we talk a little bit about it before. But in a country like ours, it's hard to be avoided having this dual relationship. Or sometimes my clients end up my students at university. Again, it wouldn't be helpful to stop the therapy, and it would be helpful not to teach them. Obviously, you have to teach them. So we kind of discussed it a little bit before. So no, it would never really be an option to become their friend outside of therapy, even if the therapy has ended. For us, it's quite clear as professionals kind of where our boundaries stand. Sometimes, obviously, you get clients who either because they're not informed, they wouldn't really know about how things work, even though we tend to explain it in the first session. For clients, obviously, that have their own issues, that would want to meet you for a coffee outside, but then obviously that's kind of up to us then to kind of ensure that the boundaries are there and explain that kind of, not friends, we just have a relationship through therapy, which is always uncomfortable to have that conversation. But I think most people are aware. I think the problem I find with boundaries here is rather than asking for coffees and things like that is more kind of maybe the times in which they would text. So for example, I've gotten people texting me like I did, not just to change an appointment, like even to discuss things outside of therapy, but even just to change an appointment at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., 1 p.m. I mean, my phone is on silent, so I don't hear them. But the fact that they're doing that shows that maybe sometimes they don't realize it's a professional relationship. And I think even the fact that I don't know about other countries, but here, for example, young people have resorted to just texting through WhatsApp rather than a normal text or a normal phone call. So I think it's even more important to keep the boundaries there because for them, they just feel like they're texting a friend, potentially. But again, this is the minority of people. Most people know what the boundaries are and stick within the boundaries. But yes, we're quite strict with that. So as much as can be controlled, no dual relationships.
And in case of therapeutic abuse, so the therapist is the one that is like the abuser. Can a client turn to some organization and report the therapist or not?
There is either the psychology board and the Malta Psychology Board, and you can put in a report over there. There's also the Malta Chamber of Psychologists, which I don't know if they would take in the report or if they would refer you to the board, but obviously you can be guided there. And for the other professions, it's the same. So the regulatory bodies of the counseling profession and the psychotherapy profession. So you would definitely report to them and they would kind of guide you as to how to put in a report. And then usually that psychologist is kind of pulled up and investigated. Obviously, if it's something criminal, then I would also involve the police and not just the board, because obviously then there would need to be criminal action potentially taken against the therapist.
The sixth question, is supervision a must for a therapist in your country?
Yes, it is. The amount would be depending on how many years of experience you have. So if you're in those first 2 years, like I said, where you're called a psychology practitioner, I believe you would need every week. I'm not sure, but to get your warrant, you need to have a set amount of supervision sessions that you would have done over a period of 2 years. I think it's 90 hours. I'm not exactly sure. And then once you're warranted, I think it goes pro rata. So I'm at around 12 years experience now, and I have supervision once a month. As far as I know, you need to keep having supervision throughout your career, even if it's just like once every month or once every 2 months, but you need to be still having supervision.
That's so cool. I think that's the first country that has it like really.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, lined up. Yeah, usually it's at the beginning, you always need to have it, but then it's up to you.
Yes, because we also can randomly get audited to make sure that we're keeping up with CPD and supervision, and that's one of them that we need to list. So I'm not sure about the frequency, but as far as I know, yes, we need to keep having supervision.
Yeah, because I heard about like if you want to renew your license, you need certain education or these points, but not particular supervision. This is the first one with the supervision, which I find good. Okay, the seventh question. What are the most common complaints that a client comes to therapy for?
I think if I had to be very, very generic, if we're talking adults, it's usually anxiety and depression, but very often it's rarely a presentation of clear anxiety and depression. Usually there's underlying stuff. It's hard to say generically because when people tend to specialize, obviously we see different specializations. So for example, right now, I'm seeing a lot of perinatal cases, but I wouldn't say that's the general presentation, So I think everyone would have their own. But I think anxiety and depression and everything that falls under that. So OCD, PTSD. And then if we're talking more teens and children, I would say anxiety is a big one, unfortunately, that's on the rise. Self-harm and self-esteem issues and bullying, unfortunately, is still a big reason why we get kids coming to us for referrals. And then kind of other things like, I don't know, if the child is acting out, for example, there's behavioral issues, but then we would need to see what's causing that. So are there problems at home, problems at school? But that's kind of more the acting out. It wouldn't really be it would be a reason for referral, but it wouldn't be a diagnosable condition. I think those would be the generic ones, I think. I mean, obviously there's a lot more, but the big ones, I think, would normally be those. And then once you start working, you kind of uncover everything else that you kind of have to deal with and work with.
How history events influence mental health in population now, or basically, is there any collective trauma that you are witnessing now?
I'm not sure, to be honest, how to answer that question. Obviously, we're working a lot more with PTSD and adjustment disorders because obviously we have the migrants coming who would have had an extremely traumatic experience crossing over. They would have lost family members. Most of them would have spent all their money coming here. They would have seen lots of trauma in their own country, which is obviously why they're coming here. So there's lots of PTSD that is work that is being done in the refugee centers and things like that. But I don't know what the effect will be kind of in the future,
Okay, the last question. If you would share one tool, belief, or approach that is a must-have for you as a therapist, what would that be?
I don't know if it's a tool, but I guess maybe a message. Maybe again, because I've moved into this area, sometimes people think that what happens to children will be forgotten, which is never the case. I've worked with children who were looked after children, child protection cases. I've worked with them as grown-ups. They don't forget. The words remain imprinted in their mind. The type of attachment they have remains imprinted, and it obviously affects their own relationships as adults, and then how they parent their own children. So what I would say is kind of almost from when they're born, we need to take care of these people, They're fully dependent on us as babies, and I think we need to do a good enough job with them, because sometimes I feel like we're doing excellent jobs. I feel like sometimes we're not doing such a great job. And the idea is he's not going to remember. But like that book says, the body remembers, the body keeps score. He might not remember it in words, but they will embody the experience, and then we worry why they're acting out and why they're bullying and biting other kids. And so I think it's just, a message that we have to take our responsibilities quite seriously not just as parents, I think as a nation, because we're all responsible at the end of the day. These are going to be the people who are going to take care of us when we're older. So I think kind of being a bit more kind in general, less of keyboard warriors, if that makes sense. So I've had clients telling me that children in their school, outside of school, have told them, these are 10-year-olds, you need to go and kill yourself. What are you still doing here? You're a waste of space. Which is obviously really not okay. Telling another 10-year-old you need to go jump off a cliff is like completely unacceptable. So I think maybe more awareness that our children are suffering. I feel like their problems are getting worse. They have less tools to deal with stress. I wouldn't say they have more stress. They might, but I think I'm seeing them growing up to be slightly less resilient. And that I think is a big concern of mine. So I think maybe tackling this problem sooner rather than later, before we have kind of a whole cohort of adults who are struggling on a consistent basis.